Before we move on to Rathnew, let's pause and reflect. Man, of course, was in Ireland long before the founding of Rathnew. We have only to look at the major fort in Baltinglass, 800 to 700 years BC, or think of Newgrange, 5,000 years old. We know of the prehistoric paths which led inland from along the coast. One of them from Manton in Wicklow, down what we now call the Old Road, down through Rathnew, Merrymeeting, along to Milltown North, wending its way up by the side of Roundwood, and down to the foot of the Wicklow Gap, and on into the plains of Kildare. We'll start in the 1st century with Ptolemy's map of Hibernia, as we were known to the Romans. His map shows part of present-day Dublin, all of County Wicklow, and part of Wexford as Manappee. This was later known as Coola. The Dublin-Wicklow Mountains were the Coola Mountains, and one of the 5 great roads leading to Tara came this way, the Coola Way. The Celts roamed across Europe before and during the Roman time. Some of them settled in Scotland, some in Wales, and a large number settled in Ireland. If we think of the terrain at that time, landing at the coast would in most places be hazardous. Cliff-faced, forests inland a bit from the sea, large areas of swamp, and the mouth of the rivers would not be as we know them today. We have to remember all this movement took place long before drainage banked up rivers and so forth. I'm sure if we stood on the rock in Rathnew at that time, we would of course have to wipe from our minds buildings, walls and roads. But let's stand looking towards Ashford. All we would see is, beneath the rock, swamp, briars, trees, and a narrow winding path leading towards present-day Milltown North, down by the side of Roundwood, and onto the foot of and over the Wicklow Gap and into the plains of Kildare. This then is what would have faced the travellers, having landed at Manton and made their way down the Old Road through the present village of Rathnew onwards. We move on now to the Heath, a flat stretch of land between Portlaoise and Kildare. This is where Nee, a minor chief, gathered his clan and struck off for the east coast on what must have been a very difficult journey, back down the gap in the opposite direction to previous incoming tribes, and continued on in search of a suitable location on the east coast. It was when he finally reached the spot now known as Rathnew that he stopped and built his fort, erecting the fortification, the earthen mound around it. Now, How many of the tribe he brought with him, I'm afraid I don't know, but I imagine it would have to be in the region of about 200 men, women and children. We can see the site chosen had a lot going for it. High ground, water supply, and there must have been an amount of fertile land. And in addition, it straddled the prehistoric path leading from Manton. His fort must have covered a sizable area, because he had to house the families of his tribe, any livestock he may have had if he brought it with him, and he had to have a good defensive system built around it for protection. This place then was in actual fact the birth of Rathnew, Rathnew. And we note also around this time Christianity is beginning to spring up here and there. St. Pedrogue had a hermitage at present-day Kilpedder in 480 AD. It was here, in fact, that St. Kevin, who was born around the year 500, was educated. Kevin's people, or his tribe, came from somewhere around the southeast of Rathnew. It was in Nee's Fort, in what was to become much later known as the Old Village. AD, and having spent most of his life around the village, he died about 635 AD. Now, in order for Ernan to build his church, he had to have the goodwill of the pagan chief of the day, Nee. Nee, I expect, had a successor by this time, and having the goodwill of the chief of Rathnew, it's most likely he was given a prime site, probably in the middle of the fort. So we could really take the old graveyard and the ruin of Ernan's church as the centre of the fort. By the time we reach the end of the 8th century, we find that the fortification surrounding the settlement has been destroyed, and Ernan's church is no longer listed as being in use. There is a tradition that the Danes occupied Rathnew for a brief period, and indeed, if we look at the dates I will mention, I think it ties in with the destruction of the fort. In 795, the Danes first attacked along the coast of Ireland, and we do know that in 884 they plundered and destroyed Glendalough. So it's quite likely Rathnew, standing as it did on one of the prehistoric roads inland, was destroyed by the Danes in 795. Ernan had another church at Ballynerran, but I doubt if there's any indication about the site of that church. The lives of the saints state quite clearly that where Ernan built his church in 600 AD was later the old village of Rathnew. There can be no doubt that when we are standing in the old graveyard, we are standing in the old fort, the original settlement of Rathnew. I believe this site became a Christian burial ground in the 8th century because this followed a pattern among Christians. They tended, where a church became disused, to have their burial ground around the church to be buried on Christian soil. While we have mentioned Manton several times in connection with prehistoric pathways, Manton's church is believed to have stood on the site of the present courthouse in the market square in Wicklow. Before we move away from the old graveyard, we should remember, in terms of history, it is the most important part of Rathnew. In the old graveyard, we are standing in the heart of the fort. It is actually the centre of the antiquity of Rathnew. Let's move along now to about 1162, and we'll talk about the church at Drumcay, Knockrovin. In the early part of the 12th century, Knockrovin was known as Drumcay, and according to Price's place names, Drumcay may mean the Ridge of the Holy Man. It was on this site that St. Lawrence O'Toole, the Abbot of Glendalough, built a church dedicated to St. Berchan to serve the people of Rathnew and Drumcay. Wicklow town was at that time under the control of the Normans, and the Abbot of Glendalough didn't have any authority in Wicklow town. Drumcay was the extent of his diocese. Rathnew and Drumcay were in the diocese of Glendalough, hence the building of the church at Drumcay. So we can take it from that. There must have been a settlement at Drumcay. The area or townland was then known for a period as Kill St. Lawrence, the Church of St. Lawrence. Now, the vicar of St. Patrick's Church in Wicklow in 1442 was John O'Byrne, and I will quote a papal letter. He is in certain events to serve St. Berchan's Church, Drumcay. It seems that for several years the people of Drumcay and Rathnew had been attending the church in Wicklow instead of their own church in Drumcay, which the rector, John Carney, had allowed to fall into a state of dilapidation and ruin. As a result of an inquiry, Carney was deposed, and O'Byrne of Wicklow was appointed to Drumclay in addition to Wicklow. After the death of O'Byrne, Donnacha MacEgan was appointed to the vicarage of Wicklow and the rectory of Drumclay. And we find in the last 20 years of the 15th century, Wicklow once more became a church in the diocese of Glendalough. An important list of early churches in Wicklow, believed to have been dated around 1275 AD. This document mentions 5 churches within the limits of the present parish, which of course were not the only ones, but were probably the principal churches in the district as follows: Rathnew, Kilpool, St. Thomas, Kilmanton and Wicklow. There was a Christian burial ground attached to St. Berkin's in Drumclay. I believe this is down towards the main road, near the railway embankment, where human bones were dug up shortly after 1897. The burial ground is not marked, and there is no sign today of where the church stood, but fortunately the church ruin is shown on old maps. At a later stage we find the original band room in the quarry in Rathnew was used as a chapel, attended by a curate from Wicklow, and this continued up to, I think, around 1870, when the curate stopped coming out to Rathnew and the people had to go to Wicklow on all holy days of obligation to Mass. Now this meant a long trek in all kinds of weather for men, women and children from around the area of Cuckoo Corner, the village, and quite a distance in other directions. It meant a lot of hardship. It was a period of hunger, not a lot of food, poorly clothed, very often going barefooted to Mass. The church was very strict on the fasting regulations. Fasting from midnight if receiving communion, and all holy days were compulsory attendance, and there were many of them. It is astonishing. Picture the scene. Fasting from midnight meant by the time they would return to, let's say, Cuckoo Corner, it would be midday, after a long journey on foot, still fasting, facing cold houses, lighting fires, preparing meals. The incredible hardship the people suffered, shivering, saturated, soaked children and women on that long trek, because we must remember an hour and a half was compulsory for a Mass, no exceptions. We were bound under pain of mortal sin to attend. And when one thinks One journey by a well-fed curate on horseback down the old road from Wicklow to the quarry in Rathnew could have saved all this hardship. This continued until 1882, when the present chapel was completed. The people of Rathnew contributed to the cost of building in weekly contributions. On looking at an old map, we find the civil parish of Rathnew in 1685 was quite an important place and covered a considerable area, extending almost into Wicklow, taking in Balnabarney, Balnalee, Clonmannon, and indeed on down into Kilopter. In 1837 we find the population of Rathnew was 544 with 107 houses. In 1840 an entire street of houses in Ashford was demolished and the families evicted, leaving 8 to 10 families homeless and utterly destitute. Most of these made their way to the old village in Rathnew, where they lived on the commons until such time as they could build cabins for themselves. They came into the village with nothing except their families. No food, no clothing, additional clothing, nothing. And we may think of the misery they endured. The families out under open skies in all kinds of weather, until they could be provided with shelter by the local people. These people were evicted from the O'Carroll estate in Ashford. As we move along then to 1869, we see a major row raging in the local paper, the Wicklow newsletter, about who first invented the velocipede, bicycle to you, let me add, or as it was also called, the dandy horse. And it transpired that it was made by John Taylor of Rathnew in 1845, and he used to ride at speeds of up to 12 miles per hour. Also in the Wicklow newsletter we note articles ranging for and against the coming vote on papal infallibility, and a rather sad thing in December 1869. There were 4 thatched houses destroyed by fire in the village, caused by a candle catching curtains. The flames spread so rapidly and the houses were so close together that 3 of them were totally destroyed before the fire could be checked on the 4th one. Following the fire, Miss Cholmondeley of Claremont launched an appeal for subscriptions, and Reading through the list of subscriptions now in front of me, I note the Archbishop of Dublin gave £1, the Reverend H.J. Toome £1, Reverend Drought per Mr. Byrne 8 shillings, and the Reverend H. Brownrigg 5 shillings. Now, the curious thing about this, the Archbishop of Dublin and all the clergy I have mentioned are actually Church of Ireland. Mr. Courtney, the building contractor, Rathnew, was paid for rebuilding 3 cabins at a total cost of £11 10 shillings. That's less than £4 per house. Also in the Wicklow newsletter, we see a very angry article to the editor. A resident in Wentworth Place objects to the constant driving of donkey water carts by a parcel of noisy boys, shouting and screaming at the poor animals and at each other. They commence early each morning drawing water and continue the annoyance all day. Could they not be obliged to go quietly? This, of course, was Wicklow town before piped water, when water was drawn by donkey water carts and sold from door to door and street to street. A note also from Rathnew Union, the poorhouse. The state of the house, 1870. Remaining occupants, 229. Corresponding last year, 424. The average cost of feeding each inmate weekly, 2 shillings 7 pence. And this is followed by a notice on the remarkable fact of the total disappearance of smallpox from Ireland. And they go on to say, now the greatest danger of its reintroduction is from the arrival of the sailors from India and the compulsory removal of the Irish paupers from England. Now, this should interest any house hunter in Rathnew. I'll read it as it appears in the paper. To be sold with full and complete possession guaranteed to the purchaser in the usual course for about £25. A plot of ground in Rathnew with 4 labourers' dwellings and a good yard. Rent-free forever. There is considerable spare ground in front and rear. This is an opportunity rarely met. The houses are presently let to weekly tenants and produce about £8 per annum. Now, before the rush starts, that was in December 1869. I have checked a number of papers for this period and note the crime rate in Rathnew was very, very light. So light, today we could call it a crime-free zone. The Franco-Prussian War of 1869, and we are in 1870, brought a measure of prosperity to the Rathnew area. Horse exports were up, cattle prices had improved, and it reflected to some extent on the villagers, most of whom were farm labourers. We'll move along now to the 1900s. Again, World War I brought a measure of prosperity and a measure of grief to the village. 168 young men from the village joined the British Army. Many of them died in France. Many of them came home crippled. And it was also a time of great unrest. The conscription bill had been passed, and it, of course, was strongly resisted. We find that in 1918, a Sinn Féin band from Ashford, passing along to support the anti-conscription movement in Wicklow, was assaulted in the Lower Main Street in Rathnew. No doubt because of the great number of men from the village who were actually fighting in France at the time. 1918, also the deaths of Privates Mara and Collard from the village in France. But it was, I suppose, we could call it a boom time for the village. Timber pit props were being exported from Wicklow. Headstones from Willie Stephen's father, who had a considerable business as stonemasons. A lot of his work was carted up to the railway at Rathnew and transported to many parts of Ireland. The brickworks was going strong, and Clark's sawmill employed quite a lot. However, in November 1920, a large part of the mill was destroyed by fire, resulting in unemployment until a portion of it could be restored. And in December 1920, John Clark of Rathnew opened the Excelsior Cinema in Wicklow. Now, I think from here we will move on into the 1930s. Very little sign of prosperity in the 30s. Very little work. Poorly paid farm labourers. Women of necessity in the fields doing back-breaking work, digging out the potato crop. And I can recall, as others can, of course, the picking of frockens in Ballymanus Wood and around that area. It was normal in the season to see a large number of women from the village heading off to the woods with their tin cans and buckets for the frockens, which were used in the making of dye for clothes. They were weighed and emptied into large barrels at the archway to Matt Doyle's farm in the lower street, and when filled were taken to Dublin. The houses, usually two-roomed, were very close together, often with large families. They were lovely thatched houses, whitewashed inside and out each year. And I often think, if we must have saints, the saints have to be the women who, despite the hardship, reared large families and reared them well in difficult conditions without complaint, and somehow managed to find enough food daily to keep the children going. The people of the old village were really wonderful people to know. They always had a cheery word, always had time to stop and speak, and ever ready to help anyone in as far as they could. But we can't shut our eyes to the fact we lived in harsh times, with the men who were fortunate enough to have work in the forestry or with the farmer, heading off with his billy can of tea. He had his mug of cold tea and a couple of slices of bread at midday. And the 40-hour week had not even been thought of at that time. Another regular sight in the village was the women with large bundles of sticks across their backs, dragging them from Somerville's wood up to the old village to keep the fires going. And now to entertainment. Football was, of course, an important part of village life, and music. We had gifted musicians. The Rathnew fife and drum band practiced regularly in the band room. Toss schools were another pastime, usually played under the deal trees near the foot of the rock. And the more serious ones were played up Charvey, where bigger money went on the ground. It was, of course, illegal. Another forgotten sport was the top, the spinning top, which was launched by a twine wrapped around it and spun fast onto the ground, while the whipping top was kept in motion by whipping it with a lash. These tops were carved out of suitable wood by a number of men in the village. The carving called for great skill, as balance was essential for a good top. The village had a tradition for small industries. Flannel was made here until about 1860. Dennismara carried on a 200-year tradition of basket weaving and supplying lobster pots to the fishermen of Wicklow. Nails were also made down on the lower street by people named Tyre. There were also a number of clog makers who made clogs from the elder tree Hand-sewn boots were made to measure up to the 1930s by the Jacob family. In addition to all this, there is a long tradition of music in Rathnew, going back to the first band room built in the quarry in the 1700s to the present band room in 1927. Some will recall the old fife and drum band and numerous accordion players in the village. There was a wealth of musical talent in Rathnew. Around 1935 we saw a dramatic change in the village with the building of 52 new houses on Larburns Field, the bank. This in turn led to the transfer of families from detached houses into the completed new houses, and as detached houses were emptied, they too were replaced by modern housing. While on the one hand we might call this the death of the old village, in actual fact it was really the old village coming of age. It had remained unchanged for several hundred years until 1935. The first of the new houses were actually occupied in 1937. While this, of course, was a major upheaval in the village, it meant a vast improvement in living standards. Detached houses were on average two-roomed houses with washing facilities very poor, no running water, and the sole means of heating one open fire. As we move along then into the 1940s, the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 saw a large number of young men from the village join the Irish Army, myself included, until the end of the emergency period. It also saw a large number of men and women heading off to Britain, where there was considerable employment during the war years and for quite a while afterwards. The village was always noted for the fierce pride the people of Rathnew took in their own place. We saw that at football matches. Let's take Ockram in the past. Bicycles, ponies and traps, a nod lorry and a few cars heading off to Ockram. The village would be deserted on the Sunday of a major match. We see the same pride today with our own local groups, the Development Association and all the other groups striving for a better Rathnew. And we think of all that has been accomplished: pathways, paving, Tarmacadam, a host of improvements. And we should remember, things do not just happen in a place, they are made to happen by the tireless work of dedicated groups. Now, if I were asked what would I like to see in the village, my wish in my lifetime, not merely the restoration of the band room, but demolish and build a new two-story one with the ground floor for a library and the upper floor for music lessons, all kinds of music and instruments. And let's relaunch a band in the village again. St. Bridget's Hall, the same thing, demolish and build a two-story hall. There was plenty of room at the rear at the quarry end. The ground floor for drama, dancing and functions, and the upper floor rooms for various groups. We had the band room and the plaza in regular use in the 1930s, when our population was around 600. Today we have only one hall with a population, I think, of about 2,000 and increasing. Now, here I leave you with a simple slán leat, and thank you for listening so patiently. Best wishes, Paddy Mulvihill.